So today my remarks are on the subject of statecraft, past, present and future, and I don't want to spend all my time defining what statecraft is or get too deep into academic theology, but I should probably start with a working definition. Statecraft is called different things in different languages, and indeed, of course, as Iskander was saying, it means different things in different eras. In French, it is often called raison d'etat, a reason of state, a term which became popularized in the early modern period, but was sometimes juxtaposed awkwardly with Enlightenment ideas. In Germany, it is sometimes, somewhat misleadingly, called realpolitik, a more austere credo that urges people to adapt to the harsh realities of power politics. And in the English language, statecraft is sometimes used interchangeably with the idea of the national interest or the practice of high politics, usually, although not exclusively, in foreign policy or national security, rather than the general din of democratic politics, parliaments, elections, policy making more broadly in the round. So here the emphasis, to go back to what Phil Zelikow was saying, is on the craft part of statecraft, seen in the professionalization of diplomacy, intelligence, and the military, a departure from the old days, certainly in the English context, when the aristocracy, those with the means to engage in such activities, used to go bumbling around the globe like well-educated pirates. Now, in my own definition, statecraft is a little less austere than the German tradition, and perhaps a little less self-consciously professionalized than the English language version. It sits somewhere in between, trying to strike a balance between wily self-awareness and burning fury at the hypocrisy or stupidity of others. It creates, crucially, or it contains a creative as well as a critical impulse. It is more than a cult of the national interest. It must build outward and upward to grasp the future rather than simply refine and adapt to the circumstances in which it is practiced. It must be optimistic in spirit, if skeptical in approach. It is an art and not a science. And it is also, crucially, and this is why I slightly depart from Phil's definition, it is as much about the internal coherence and functioning of the state. Think back to the Federalist Papers, think back to Machiavelli, about the state's internal mechanics as well as great matters of international diplomacy overseas. And modern statecraft must not only adapt to the realities of democratic life, but it should seek to harness and deploy them in the interests of the state. But rather than giving you a history today, I want to do something new, or at least something that I have not done before, which is to distill rather than define, and to do so in my own words, so though you will recognize that many of the things I say are familiar in classical texts and are perhaps being subliminally placed in my soul by the politicians I have worked with, perhaps less by others, and I'll come to that in a moment. First of all, and this is new for me, I want to begin to synthesize some of the observations that I have made from an academic career, studying statecraft, particularly as a biographer, which I think is a good route to understanding statecraft, with the experience of now working for 4 years in government, and to come to a sense of how those two worlds meld together. Now, the mistake that academics make who go into government, sometimes the mistake they sometimes make is to assume they are bringing some sort of pure form of knowledge to be opened carefully at the cabinet room and laid out in front of the toothless scoundrels and Philistines crowded around the table. And to my mind, there's nothing more absurd, by the way, the idea there should be an official historian sitting sort of eunuch-like beside the king and offering great wisdom. All history is political in one way or another. But the worlds of study and practice can be mutually illuminating and supporting. Second, I want to outline, therefore, in the rest of my remarks, what I regard as the essential components of statecraft, or more precisely, the components of what, from both historical study and some lived experience, are the essential preconditions of what I would regard as good statecraft. And here is my reveal, if we can have our slide. My remarks should not be treated, of course, with biblical authority, but I seem to have stumbled upon 10 commandments. So I will go as far as these 10 commandments and go briefly through each. They come, I should also say, with a sense of hierarchy, and I hope a sense of a logical progression between them. The first component of statecraft, or good statecraft in my view, is what a reasonably developed sense of what has come before. This is where, of course, the historian is rather scratching, patting oneself on the back for the types of skills they can bring to government. Frank Gavin, our colleague who's here today, calls this a historical sensibility. Historical sensibility is an essential component of statecraft. Now, in its purest form, it is reflected in Machiavelli's view that one must understand the classical world and, of course, its great historians to navigate the early modern world. But one need not be a practitioner or an expert in history to achieve this. But one must have the ability to interrogate assumptions, also lazy assumptions, about how we got to this point. And one must have a sense, crucially, of what others think about what has happened in the immediate and medium-term past as well. These narratives and these stories have considerable political force in a way that does not necessarily depend on the veracity or truth of those stories. History and analogy is the language of government in almost every single policy area. It is therefore the starting book of any good copybook of statecraft to have that sense of historical sensibility and presence. Second, and this is why I hope these follow logically from this, and it flows naturally from the first, a fulsome appreciation of the parameters in which you operate, I think, is the second precondition to good statecraft. The parameters can be the system in which you operate. How does it work? Where do you sit within it? What levers can be pulled? In what ear or whose ear must you whisper? Perhaps when the civil servant walks out of the room. Or just a moment, Prime Minister. There's one thing I haven't talked to you about yet. Shut the door. It is obvious that life is easier at the apex of your system, or that you have more agency, or that you can wait your moment. It is also true that longevity in government gives you more opportunity to learn how to exert your influence and to learn your trade on the job. And the closer you get to the throne, I would suggest, the easier it is for you to exercise influence and power through good manners, kind words, and patience. In a more precarious position, it might be more wise, alternatively, to scratch the occasional pair of eyes out, or to be noisy or difficult to be heard. And there's no virtue in one form or the other. It depends on where you sit in the system. And then far more important than those parameters of your internal system are the parameters beyond your system. And this is where foreign policy comes in. People spend too long, I think, looking within or working out which metric or self-assessment process is most important when the world around them changes more swiftly than that.
John, you've done 2 components and have 8 left. I'm a little worried about the timekeeping.
I'm okay, don't worry. This will go very quickly. Edmund Burke said circumstances are the condition of defining condition of any political scenario, and so the questions you must ask yourself are: how much domestic room for maneuver do you have? How firmly do you have your hands on the reins of power? And what appetite do you have for risk? And that, of course, applies to international politics. There are the obvious metrics of power: the size of the economy, the proportion of GDP, the size of your army. These are the hierarchies, the organizations in which you work, and the organizations that do work or don't work. And appreciation of these objective realities is the baseline for any form of successful statecraft. And I will go faster than that. How long do I have, Ulf? Remaining?
We have some 5 minutes left.
Oh, I'll easily do that. Next, a theory of change. The reason to know your history and to establish the parameters in which you operate is not to succumb meekly to them. Otherwise, statecraft would only be about mowing the lawn and tending the plants. So therefore, as the next evolutionary step in statecraft, successful statecraft also requires a theory of change. Now, those theories of change have to be reassessed and re-examined in government. The respect the sea, your mother may have told you, but also crucially for statecraft, you have to find a way of swimming in the sea or riding the waves in the sea as well. I have been in periods of government when we have felt completely stuck in a box and unable to move left or right, only to burst free by serendipity, accident, or occasionally acumen. And wisdom and opportunism as well. I have seen Leninist approaches to change in government, without naming names, that have got very far, very quick, using the tools of the vanguard to engineer a jolt in historical development. Yet I'd also reflect that some forms of change can run out of momentum or left screaming at the moon or raging against the machine. So sometimes it is better to redefine the existing lexicon, win over a wider grouping by speaking their language and showing that you're more attuned to their concerns. And of course, again, the same goes to foreign policy. Good statecraft means that you can exert an influence that is outsized to your size by traditional metrics. that is not simply dependent on those objective realities that can go beyond them. Fourth, a creative as well as a critical mind. Statecraft has to be a creative effort to construct as well as to analyze and critique. And sometimes this is where academia does government a disservice. The balance between the creative impulse in study, the desire to create, be visionary, articulate how something should work, say the United Nations or an organization like NATO, versus the capacity for critique has got imbalanced. And it's got imbalanced by government, by the provision, in academia, by the profusion of things like critical studies as well. Statecraft requires the creative impulse, crucially. Fifth, on the back of this, a generally liberal mind. I sometimes think in government that everything is true and nothing is true simultaneously. And when you sit around a table of people in government, it is rarely that someone does not have a point. And the job of good statecraft is to synthesize those different observations. There is no single form of truth, and we must be ecumenical in the tools of analysis. Don't approach something as a high political historian and taking those models into government, or a Marxist alone, or a Burkean, or whatever it is. If you approach those questions narrowly, you will miss the way that others think about those challenges and problems. So always remain ecumenical and genuinely liberal in your mind. 6, I told you I'd make it, Ulf. An appreciation of the spiritual over the hyper-rational. I've talked about objective realities. Governments are obsessed with metrics. Political science, I think, has slipped too far in government, not helped by an over-reliance on constant polling. So these objective realities must be respected and understood, but they must also involve imponderables like mood and tone and zeitgeist and language. And Ludwig von Rocker, the creator of Realpolitik in the 19th century, noted that the art of politics in the democratic age was to distinguish between momentary fashions and impulses and intellectual fashions and settled and received wisdom. And the power of the zeitgeist, he argued, was the single most defining force in politics. I think that is true of anything today. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you President Zelensky, for an example. 7, avoid the traps of presentism. I have my mind on the next panel. Statecraft should also always be based on a sense of perspective. We always hear, and we have heard in every age, technology will change everything. I can't think of an age in which hasn't that anxiety about technology been there. Or the current obsessions. We have lost the global middle ground with us over Ukraine. When was the global middle ground ever with the Western alliance during the Cold War? What standards are we here? Another one, the authoritarians do grand strategy better than us silly democracies. Look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I ask you to pause on that. Or the authoritarians will get out of COVID faster and give us all a headache and provide a model versus a democracy. So avoid that presentism, because presentism will give you crippling angst. 8, the components of statecraft must, and this is where we begin to look forward in my final few remarks, it must begin to expand to include new domains. Economics, technology, and science are essential to the affairs of state in the way they haven't been for the last 3 decades or beyond. More than any point, I think, since the Second World War, trade is also an essential tool of statecraft. And this applies to areas like science and technology, and statecraft is changing in many other ways. Different types of dilemmas, therefore, emerge for large regulatory blocs who want to set terms and conditions, who yearn for self-sufficiency, and medium and small-sized powers who must prioritize agility and speed of action. And in my final 2 remarks, this is where I think statecraft needs to go next. 9, statecraft needs grand strategy. And grand strategy is hard, but a statecraft that simply refines, adapts, and responds to objective realities is not enough. Grand strategy is a higher or the highest form of statecraft, to quote Hal Brands. It brings together these different component parts, history, strategy, warfare, international relations, diplomacy, with the newer arts of statecraft, economics, technology, research, and science, and it tries to combine them with national purpose. Grand strategy is very hard, but grand strategy is an absolute necessity, and we must relearn the art. And then finally, number 10, statecraft needs to rediscover the art of planning once more. This is hard, and I've experienced it in a government that's used to being dependent on an open international economic system that suits it. But planning is something that liberal democracies and free market economies feel somewhat uncomfortable about historically, but it is a necessary precondition to respond to the competition we faced. It is not the same as grandiose projects to remake the world, but being passive respondents and adapters to the planning of others, which is well underway, by the way, is not good statecraft. And we've done this before. We did this very effectively in the 40s and 50s. But the concern and the anxiety about this is as old as ever. I give you one quote on which I will end. Francis Bacon, a scientist, philosopher, advisor to Elizabeth I, said this, and I think these words stick with me. "This is true," he bemoaned, "that the wisdom of all these latter times in princes' affairs is rather fine deliveries and shifting of dangers and mischiefs when they are near, rather than what Bacon wanted, solid and grounded courses to keep them aloof." So our plans need not be the best laid plans. They may get cracked and they may sometimes even get scrambled, but we must learn again to try and lay the egg. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Can you give us a bright, shining example when many of these 10 components were at play?
I can give you an example of different components being at play. Number 6, I want to pick out an appreciation of the spiritual over the hyper-rational. Many of the metrics and assessments we had on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine suggested that Russia would likely run over the Ukrainian army extremely swiftly, that its air dominance would allow it to sort of collapse the Ukrainian self-defense forces within 2 weeks by some assessments. The imponderable, and the thing that I don't think Putin fully calculated, but was something that was shaped in the moment, but was hard to decipher and hard to capture, was that Ukrainian sense of national purpose, national defense, and unity under great stress and pressure. And that was such a powerful force, Ukraine's ability to fight and resist, and the story and the way the narrative emerged on the back of it was something that was not in the metrics, not in the objective realities, but I think the single most defining factor in Ukraine's response and the broader Western response to it.